Russia's made very little progress since its initial invasion of Ukraine, but there's one town that Vladimir Putin wants to capture more than all the rest. He sent thousands of men, tanks, and mercenaries to the Donetsk region of Ukraine just so Russia can gain control of the city of Bakhmut. The crazy thing is that Bakhmut doesn't hold much military significance, and yet Putin refuses to give up on it. What makes this small city so important to Putin, and why is he so obsessed with capturing it? Before the Russian invasion, the town had a population of just over 70,000 people. The main reason why Russia is so hell-bent on capturing Bakhmut has to do with the failures of the Russian military more than anything else. Putin doesn't just want to capture Bakhmut, he needs to capture Bakhmut to show that Russia can still achieve some sort of victory. But with each Russian attempt to capture and hold the city, Ukrainian forces have bravely stepped up to meet the challenge and held their ground. Before we get into the specific reasons for Russia's obsession with capturing Bakhmut, let's take a look at what's happened to the town. Unfortunately, the willingness to do whatever it takes to capture Bakhmut has led Russian forces to commit atrocities and do unspeakable things to the civilians living there. War crimes have almost certainly been carried out by mercenaries hired by Putin and his regime. Ukrainian forces moved into Bakhmut to halt the Russian invasion advancing across the region. They knew that the city would be a good place to hold the line because it served as a gateway further into eastern Ukraine. The brave soldiers set up barricades and aided civilians to shelters that would hopefully provide them with some protection from the coming carnage. Russia's already proved that they have very little regard for civilian life from the onset of the invasion. Anyone who was able to take up arms in Bakhmut was asked to do so by the Ukrainian military. Men and women of all ages were equipped with whatever weapons were available, while anyone who was able to evacuate was encouraged to do so. The Ukrainians prepared for battle. It was still night when the artillery shells first started to drop. The silence of the chilly night was broken by the far-off explosions of cannons firing. The Ukrainian commanders yelled at the forces to seek cover as a barrage of shells fell from the heavens above. The Russians had been pushing through eastern Ukraine towards Bakhmut for several days. They'd met resistance, but managed to push forward. Retreating Ukrainian soldiers had warned the forces in Bakhmut that the Russian onslaught was coming and that they would need to make a stand within the city. Bakhmut would provide them with some protection while also allowing supplies coming in from western Ukraine to reach them. When the artillery shells ceased firing, the sound of tank engines could be heard rumbling toward the town. The Ukrainians entrenched themselves and fended off the Russian attack. They took to the streets and set up urban choke points where they could counteract Russia's superior numbers. The tactic worked, and the Russians sustained heavy casualties in the initial attack. They were forced out of Bakhmut, and they once again unleashed artillery strikes on the town. But the Ukrainians didn't give up, and this is what's been driving Vladimir Putin crazy. Initially, Putin and his military advisors assumed that they should be able to take most of the Donbas region of Ukraine without much of a fight. However, Ukrainian resistance forces refused to give up, and they continued to hold Bakhmut even after numerous Russian attacks. The inability of Russian forces to take Bakhmut and advance further west into Ukraine has been a huge embarrassment for Putin. Since the late spring of 2022, Russia has been bombarding the city of Bakhmut with missiles and sending ground forces into the city, hoping they could push the Ukrainian soldiers out of the area. The Russians almost gained control of Bakhmut when Ukrainian troops were forced to retreat from Luhansk in July. This advance brought the Russian artillery, tanks, and soldiers to the city's front door. However, this wasn't the worst part for the Ukrainians. On top of the Russian military, there was another group of soldiers pushing to infiltrate the city. Unfortunately, these soldiers were part of the Wagner Group, a band of mercenaries that Russia hired to do their dirty work. Once the Russian forces secured the outskirts of the city, they unleashed an iron rain upon Bakhmut daily. The Russians would send soldiers and members of the Wagner Group to probe the area and identify if they had successfully caused the Ukrainian forces to retreat. Much to their dismay, the Ukrainians in the city refused to give up. This was when Russia decided to escalate its tactics to war crime levels. The Russians continually shelled the city, causing civilians there to live in constant fear of being blown up. Those who could be evacuated were, but there were and still are elderly citizens and families that cannot get out. With the constant bombardment, there's no safe way for them to escape the carnage of the Russian war machine. There's no heat or electricity, which means the only source of warmth and light during the cold nights comes from burning debris. This is the situation that the Wagner Group takes advantage of to do their dirtiest work. They torture citizens for information and kill without regard. But who is this group of mercenaries, and why are they aiding Russian forces in Bakhmut and throughout Ukraine? When the Russian military couldn't secure Bakhmut and therefore the Russian advance through the Donbas region came to a halt, Putin employed the help of the Wagner Group. This band of mercenaries doesn't seem to have an official governing body. But when Russia needs someone to do their dirty work, they always seem to be available. The Wagner Group first appeared, or at least was first noticed by the world in 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea. It was here that the Wagner Group murdered innocent people and dealt with anyone who spoke out or tried to stop Putin from annexing the region. Since then, and even during the current incursion into Bakhmut, it's believed that the Wagner Group is being somewhat controlled by a man named Dmitry Utkin. Utkin was a former Russian GRU intelligence soldier who retired in 2013. It was around this time that the Wagner Group was created. Interestingly, while in the Russian military, Utkin's call sign was Wagner, which was one of the reasons many believe he started the group of mercenaries and is their de facto leader. However, since there doesn't seem to be any real chain of command, Utkin might just be more of a field commander. The Wagner Group works in other parts of the world as well, including Mozambique, Mali, and the Central African Republic. It's here that the United Nations has accused the mercenaries of grave human rights abuses, such as torture and executions. Basically, the Wagner Group will kill for anyone who will pay them. Now, those same mercenaries are in Bakhmut, where they're likely committing similar atrocities. The hiring of the Wagner Group to aid in the fight for the city just goes to show how obsessed Putin is with securing it. The sad part is that Russia needed to bring in outside help, and they still can't capture their objective. Reports uncovered by The Times indicate that the Wagner Group deployed around 400 mercenaries to Ukraine early in 2022 to assassinate President Volodymyr Zelensky and key members of his government. They failed, but this operation was likely paid for by the Russian government in preparation for the invasion. As the war continued and Russia struggled to make progress, the number of mercenaries deployed by the Wagner Group increased to over 1,000 men. Now more and more are being sent to Bakhmut to help Russia achieve its goal of capturing the city. It seems that Russia hires the Wagner Group whenever they need something shady done. This is probably to give the Russian government plausible deniability if things go sideways. Putin and his regime adamantly insist that they don't know anything about the Wagner Group or have ever employed them to fight for Russia, but this is a clear lie, as the mercenaries have been spotted fighting alongside Russian soldiers throughout Ukraine and in Bakhmut. Again, Bakhmut isn't the most strategically important city in the region, but Putin and his military advisors seem to want nothing more than to capture it. They will do anything, including pay mercenaries large sums of money that the country doesn't have, to pry Bakhmut from the hands of Ukrainian forces. However, what we're seeing unfold in Bakhmut over the past few months is the same story from other places around the world where the Wagner Group has been set loose. They create terror and commit atrocious crimes, but aren't very good at holding territory. Every time Russian forces and hired mercenaries make any progress in Bakhmut, they're eventually driven back by Ukrainian forces. This just goes to show that although they might be soulless fighters who will do anything to instill fear, they're not the best soldiers. Even with the relentless strikes against the city of Bakhmut, there are still civilians there along with the Ukrainian forces. When the Associated Press visited the city to better understand what the situation was like on the ground, they found the shells of burnt-out cars, crumbling buildings, and people using firewood to cook their food in the street. Russia's desire to take the city has gotten to the point that they no longer care what happens to the people of Bakhmut, they just want to successfully hold it. The relentless bombardings of Bakhmut, the hiring of mercenaries, and the endless wave of soldiers that have been sent to try and secure the city only goes to show just how obsessed the Russians are with it. Yet, the city of Bakhmut isn't really of vital strategic value. Capturing it would give Russian forces a foothold further into the Donbas region, but there are other towns that could work just as well as a staging ground, if not be even better for it. So why are the Russians so desperate to take this particular city? Firstly, Bakhmut needs to be taken, so the Russians can safely deploy their artillery further into the region to hit other key cities, like Kramatorsk and Slovyansk. This would make things easier for Russia, but as it currently stands, they could also find ways to strike these other cities without holding Bakhmut itself. However, if they managed to take control of Bakhmut, the city would provide them with a more secure location to launch attacks and fire their missiles. On top of having a place to launch artillery from, Bakhmut would also allow Russian forces more versatility in the region. Several major routes out of Bakhmut connect to other cities in the area. If Russia could capture and maintain control of Bakhmut, which they've struggled to successfully do for months, it would provide their troops with a foothold in the region that could allow them to reach further into Ukraine. The city would also provide a good place to resupply and fall back if necessary. As things stand right now, Russia does not have the ability to move further west until they can at least control another major city in the Donbas region. If Russia managed to take Bakhmut, it would also allow them to disrupt certain supply lines that the Ukrainian military is using to resupply their forces on the Eastern Front. Putin truly believed that he'd be able to roll into Ukraine and take the entire country by force in a matter of days or weeks. Now that the war has been dragging on for months, Putin and his regime are starting to get desperate. They need to find a way to break through Ukrainian forces in the Donbas region, and it seems like securing Bakhmut may be key to this. If the Russians can secure the city and launch raids to sever supply lines to other major Ukrainian strongholds in the region, they might be able to move further west. Putin thought this should have happened long ago, but now he needs to scramble to make any type of gains. With each day that passes without Bakhmut being taken, Russian troops are becoming more and more disheartened and unsettled. Soldiers are dying without making any progress, and even as more Russian forces are thrown at a Ukrainian army that was supposed to have fallen months ago, very little progress has been made. The soldiers and the Russian people are losing faith in Putin and his regime, which brings us closer to the main reason why the leaders of Russia are so obsessed with capturing Bakhmut. There's a slight strategic significance to controlling the city, but it doesn't quite explain why Putin and his military advisors want it so badly. For the answer to this question, we need to look at how the overall war effort is going for Russia, and in a few words, it's not going well. Russia needs a win, and it needs it badly. Putin likes to present Russia as an advanced country with a powerful military. If nothing else, the war with Ukraine has proven that this is not the case. Russia is throwing everything short of nukes at Ukraine, and it hasn't seemed to make a difference. The war effort is going so badly that Russia has needed to start conscripting citizens into the military to replenish its losses from casualties and deserters. In fact, many people have fled Russia just to avoid being enlisted. Even though the state-run media is declaring the war a success so far, it's becoming clear even to the Russian people who cannot receive outside news that things are going badly. The longer the war lasts, the harder the lives of the Russian people will be, and the more likely they are to eventually rise up and remove Putin and the current regime from power. Putin desperately needs a win in Ukraine to prove that Russia is making some kind of progress. This is the key reason why Bakhmut is so important to him. Since Bakhmut is one of the closest cities to the Russian offensive line right now, it makes sense for them to capture it. Unfortunately, as Russia's military leaders are continuously finding out, this is easier said than done. But rather than trying a new tactic, Putin has doubled down on taking Bakhmut to the point of becoming an obsession. It's believed that Putin thinks taking Bakhmut is the best way to prove to the Russian people that they're winning the war. It would be the first tangible evidence that progress has been made in months. Protests are breaking out across Russia. There are large groups of people publicly speaking out against the current regime. It's a bad time to be a high-ranking official in Russia. For several years, Putin has put contingency plans in place to ensure that the public never gains enough momentum to start a full-on revolution. However, things are starting to unravel within Russia's borders. At the beginning of the war with Ukraine, the majority of Russian citizens supported Putin's decision to invade the country. However, this number is slowly declining as the people in Russia suffer due to economic sanctions and vital resources being reallocated to the failing war effort. As the lives of the Russian people have become more unbearable, there will be a further increase in protests, greater unrest, and a decline in trust in the current regime. Putin will not give up his power, and he will use his National Guard to crush any rebellions, but he currently doesn't have the men or resources to fight a war in Ukraine and a war at home. Taking Bakhmut is not just necessary so that Russian forces can advance further into Ukraine, it's vital to show that Putin is making good on his word and that Russia is winning the war. Without capturing Bakhmut, Putin has very little to show in the way of victories in Ukraine. And this is the biggest problem of all for Putin. He doesn't just need to prove that progress is being made at this point, he needs to reassure the Russian people and the world that he can still win the war. As it stands right now, the Russian advance has come to a screeching halt. Their forces have had to retreat to regroup and replenish their numbers. Basically, all these factors indicate that Russia is in fact losing the war. This was unthinkable for Putin and his regime when they launched the invasion. They believed this would be a quick victory. Instead, they found themselves on the losing side of many battles and the war itself. This is terrifying for anyone who's in a position of power in Russia, but most crucially, this is very, very bad for Putin. If Ukraine continues to resist the invasion as the Russian economy is crippled by sanctions, it'll only be a matter of time before Putin has to either pull out his forces and admit defeat or take drastic actions and turn the tide of the war, such as by using nuclear weapons. The consequences of these actions would be dire for the world, and Putin would much rather start World War III than admit defeat in his war against Ukraine. This is why he's so obsessed with Bakhmut. Defeat is not an option, and the only way that Russia can show any form of progress at the moment is by taking the city. Without any clear victories, morale is decreasing, unrest is rising, and Putin is becoming more and more reckless. The brave Ukrainian soldiers who are holding the city of Bakhmut may be the catalyst that causes the downfall of Vladimir Putin. Now watch Ukraine's plan to win the war, or check out why Putin's invasion of Ukraine is a failure.